Traditional systems of governance were destroyed or co-opted. African kings and chiefs who cooperated with colonial authorities were allowed to remain in power, but only as puppets. Those who resisted were deposed or killed. African cultures were suppressed. European languages, English, French, Portuguese, German, were imposed. African religions were deemed pagan and replaced with Christianity. African names, clothing, and customs were discouraged or banned, and African labor was exploited on a massive scale. Millions of Africans were forced to work in mines, plantations, and infrastructure projects under brutal conditions. Many died from exhaustion, disease, or violence. The wealth extracted from Africa fueled European industrialization. The rubber from the Congo powered the automobile industry. The gold and diamonds from South Africa enriched British and German banks. The cocoa from West Africa filled European chocolate factories. Africa was being drained economically, culturally, and spiritually. The colonization of Africa didn't happen in isolation. Africa became entangled in global conflicts, especially the two world wars. During World War I and World War II, millions of African soldiers fought for European powers. Africans fought in Europe, in North Africa, in Asia. They were promised freedom, equality, and recognition for their service. But when the wars ended, those promises were broken. Africans returned home to the same colonial oppression they had left behind, but something had changed. African soldiers had seen the world. They had fought alongside Europeans and seen that Europeans were not invincible. They had been exposed to ideas, democracy, self-determination, independence, and they began to organize. In the 1940s and 1950s, independence movements spread across Africa. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and Julius Nyerere in Tanzania began demanding freedom. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence. Others followed. By the 1960s, dozens of African nations had achieved independence, but independence came with a catch. African nations gained their flags, their anthems, and their seats at the United Nations. But the structures of colonialism remained. The borders drawn in Berlin stayed in place. The artificial divisions, the rival ethnic groups forced into the same nation, none of that changed. European and American corporations continued to control Africa's resources. The mines, the oil fields, the plantations, many remained in foreign hands or were managed by African elites loyal to Western interests. And when African leaders tried to assert true independence, when they tried to nationalize resources, redistribute land, or align with the Soviet Union, they were overthrown. The CIA, British intelligence, and French military forces intervened to install leaders who would cooperate. Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the independent Congo, was assassinated in 1961 with the support of Belgium and the United States. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, was killed in 1987. These are just two examples among many. This system is called neo-colonialism. Colonialism without the colonies, and it continues today. The legacy of the Berlin Conference is still visible today. The Rwandan genocide of 1994, in which nearly 800,000 people were killed, has roots in colonial divisions. The Belgian colonizers favored the Tutsi minority over the Hutu majority, creating resentment that exploded into violence decades later. The ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the deadliest conflicts since World War II, is fueled by a competition over resources and instability created by artificial borders. The civil wars in Sudan and South Sudan, the instability in Somalia, the ethnic tensions in Nigeria, all of these conflicts have roots in the decisions made in Berlin in 1884. The borders drawn by Europeans were never meant to create stable nations. They were meant to facilitate extraction, and they succeeded. But here's the important part. Africa is not defined by colonization. Despite everything, the exploitation, the violence, the artificial borders, Africa has survived. And in many ways, Africa is thriving. African economies are among the fastest growing in the world. African artists, musicians, and filmmakers are shaping global culture. African scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs are driving innovation. And Africans are reclaiming their history. They are telling the stories that were silenced. They are challenging the borders that were imposed. They are demanding justice for the atrocities committed. The Berlin Conference tried to erase Africa's agency, but it failed. Africa is still here, and Africa is rising. So, what's the lesson here? What do we take away from the story of the Berlin Conference? First, understand that history is written by the powerful. For decades, the story of Africa was told by Europeans. They called it discovery, civilization, and progress. But those were lies. The truth is that Africa was invaded, exploited, and divided. Second, recognize that borders are not natural. The lines on the map of Africa are not ancient. They are barely 140 years old. They were drawn by people who had never set foot on African soil, who didn't speak African languages, and who didn't care about African lives. Third, remember that resistance is always part of the story. Africans did not passively accept colonization. They fought, they resisted, they preserved their cultures, languages, and identities despite overwhelming odds. And finally, understand that the past is not dead. The decisions made in Berlin in 1884 still shape Africa today. The borders are still there. The economic exploitation continues in new forms. The legacy of colonialism is alive, but so is the legacy of resistance. The story of Africa is not a story of victimhood. It's a story of survival, resilience, and determination. It's a story of people who refuse to be erased. And that story is far from over. Thank you for watching this episode of Africa Hidden History. If you made it this far, you now know the truth about the Berlin Conference, the meeting that carved up Africa without African consent. You know about the resistance, the atrocities, and the legacy that still shapes the continent today. If you found this documentary valuable, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. This is the history they don't teach in schools, but it's the history that matters. Next time, we'll explore another hidden chapter of African history. Some options include the Kingdom of Kush and its rivalry with Egypt, the Great Zimbabwe Civilization, the Haitian Revolution and its African roots, or the story of Queen Nazinga of Ndongo and Matamba, a warrior queen who fought Portuguese colonization for 40 years. Let me know in the comments which story you want to hear next. Until then, remember, Africa's history is not just about what was done to it. It's about what Africa has always been: powerful, resilient, and unstoppable. See you in the next documentary.